Hey there, YouTubers. Kitten Hoarder here, and you're watching Session Report, the show that takes you to the gamer's table to share in the surprises that come out during play. And tonight, we're going to be playing Legendary... Hey there, YouTubers. Kitten Hoarder here, and you're watching Session Report, the show that takes you to the gamer's table to share in the surprises that come out during play. And tonight we're going to be playing Marvel Legendary Secret Wars, Volumes 1 and 2. And you might notice that this is not the Marvel Legendary that you're quite used to, and that's because I'm going to be showing you how to play with any of the Marvel Legendary expansion packs without using a standalone Marvel Legendary set, if you have one of the other Legendary Encounters sets available. Also, aside from a few variations to make it work with the Legendary Encounters base system, I've made a few tweaks to make this a more difficult, fully cooperative game than your typical Marvel Legendary. So, let me just briefly describe to you what's different. Okay, so to play this variant, you will obviously need one of the Marvel Legendary expansions. Preferably, you're going to want at least one of the larger expansions, that's Dark City or either of the two Secret Wars, or several of the smaller expansions, because you're going to want, at the very least, a few villain groups to be able to put into the game. If you don't have enough villain groups and you want to play with, say, you just got one of the expansions because you really like, I don't know, Guardians of the Galaxy, or you really like Captain America, then you can still try to implement this variant, but you're going to have to use some of the drone cards and other cards from your Legendary Encounters set in place of some of the villain groups and henchmen that would normally go into the game. Okay, so you're going to need that, and you're going to need one of the Legendary Encounters standalone sets. I'm using the Alien set, but you could use the Predator set, and in fact I have some cards from the Predator set, some cards from the Alien set, just whatever I felt would be most appropriate. So, here's what you're going to need to do. Set up the game as normal. Right? So I've picked a scheme here, which is smash two dimensions together. So this scheme is going to require 8 twists, although I am playing on Legendary difficulty mode, so I've upped that to 11 twists. Well, Legendary Encounters doesn't have twists, but it does have events. And instead of event cards, I've chosen to use Gear Up cards because I felt like the art was just a little bit more appropriate for this playthrough. So, instead of getting 11 scheme twists, I just dug out 11 Gear Up cards. You could use event cards from the various encounter decks. Shuffled those in with the villain groups. I'm going to be using 4 villain groups because this particular scheme requires an additional villain group and 1 henchman group. And in addition, I'm going to need some scheme twists. So the scheme twist cards, I am using these danger cards. This is also from the Legendary Encounters Predator set, but like you would be using the event cards from Legendary Encounters, you could also use the hazard cards from any of your Legendary Encounters encounter sets. You're going to have to dig through and get cards from several of the sets. But you should have plenty to fill that need. Alright, and there's one extra type of card that you don't have if you don't have any of the Marvel Legendary base sets, and that is Bystanders. I'm playing with 8 Bystanders in the deck, and I do have some special Bystanders that came with the Secret Wars sets, but I'm also using these. I don't know if these are familiar to you. Hopefully you've held on to them, but these are all of the blank cards that came with the Legendary Encounters game. You know, all of those padding cards that go at the beginning and end of all of the decks when you first open them up with from the shrink wrap. So those are going to serve as my standard, no special ability bystander cards, and then I also have some special bystanders that came with the particular expansions that I'm using. Okay, so those are pretty much it as far as the substitutions you're going to make. There's a few more things. Obviously, you do not have the starting cards from Marvel Legendary, but you do have the starting cards, obviously, from Legendary Encounters. So just use those, use the Legendary Encounters setup, and go ahead and pick an avatar for each player, because you're going to want to play with those roll cards, those roll cards shuffled into your deck. Also, play with the deck setup from Legendary Encounters, so that's slightly different from the one in base game Marvel Legendary. It's 7 and 5 rather than, I think the other one is 8 and 4 in terms of the specialists, grunts, shield agents, recruiters, whatever they are called in the Marvel set. Okay. You will also need to use the Legendary Encounters Sergeants rather than the shield, what do you call them? The shield officers. So what I did, I just went ahead and shuffled together all of these sergeants from the Legendary Encounters Alien with the Killer Instinct cards from Legendary Encounters Predator, because I just like that extra degree of surprise when you go ahead and purchase one of these sergeant cards or shield officer cards, whatever you want to refer to them as. You're never sure if you're going to get one of those really helpful cooperative cards or the sort of more selfish Killer Instinct cards. If you don't have Legendary Encounters Predator, the Killer Instinct cards are the version for the Predator mode, where you play as the Predators hunting down humans and sometimes other creatures. And the Killer Instinct cards, rather than the Coordinate ability, which lets you share your card buying power, I guess, with the other players, you get this really handy kill this card, kill a card in your discard pile. So it's a deck thinning card, in addition to 2 extra recruit points. Okay, so you're going to be using the avatars and roll cards, the starting cards, the blank cards that came with your set as bystanders. Now, if you don't have the blank cards, then you can always substitute something else, right? You have plenty of cards to use. You could, for instance, designate that the agenda cards, the evil agenda and good agenda cards, count as bystanders. Whatever you have available to use, as long as you will recognize it. I just went ahead and used the blank cards because they are very easy to recognize as cards that I don't have an actual functional ability in the game. Okay, you're going to be using those. You're going to be using events and hazards or dangers and gear up cards as your scheme twists and master strikes. Okay, you're going to be using the sergeants / commanders / killer instinct cards for the shield officers. And finally, you're going to be using the wound or strike deck from your Legendary Encounters game in place of wounds from the Marvel Legendary. Now, these function differently than the wounds do in Marvel Legendary, but you should use these as you do in Legendary Encounters. Whenever a card says you gain a wound, draw one of these random strikes and add it to your character. There are going to be very few cards that heal strikes or heal wounds in these Marvel Legendary cards, because the Marvel Legendary wounds go into your deck instead of being applied to your character, and they have their own mechanism for getting them out of your deck. They sort of are self-healing if you spend a turn doing it. So that actually makes the game a little bit more difficult. There are fewer cards that cause wounds, but if you do end up taking strikes, you very seldom have a chance to heal them, and you're going to end up with a higher probability of your character being killed than you would in many of the scenarios in Legendary Encounters. So, play with the strike rules from Legendary Encounters. I also got the chest bursters out just because I know that at least one of these strike cards is a facehugger. Now, one thing I do have to say is I like to play with a massive strike deck that's using all of the strikes from Alien and Predator, not the ones from the Predator-specific strikes, because those function very differently, but the ones from the human objectives in the Predator game. So that's why this stack might be larger than you're used to. Okay, so that's everything in terms of substitutions. Now, in terms of setup, the game is, other than that, exactly like you would set up the scheme based on the original Marvel Legendary rules. The additional rules will come into play during the game, and these are just a few rules to increase the difficulty just a little bit. So I'm going to try and run through them all as best as I can from memory. If they come up during the game, obviously I will add a note if something comes up during the game that I didn't mention here. Okay. So, one thing well, let's sort of dig through for a card here. So, in Marvel Legendary, when villains get to the end of the city, which is like the compound here, they don't go into the combat zone and start hitting you, they escape. This is going to be the same here. You're going to be using the escape rules for Marvel Legendary. When a villain escapes, in the base game rules, you are supposed to KO, that is, like, kill, any of the heroes in the HQ that has a cost of 6 or lower. In this variant, you should KO the 2 highest cost cards in the HQ. So one additional card. If there's a tie, you get to choose. In addition, and this is going to be any time a villain or mastermind has to KO something from the HQ, it's going to go with the highest cost card, and the players break ties by deciding among themselves. In addition, any card that gets KO'd during the villain phase of the game is not replaced until the end of the player's turn. So you're going to end up with fewer spaces in the HQ to choose from. Any card that you purchase during your turn will be replaced as usual. So this has a couple of effects. One, like I said, it limits your choices, and two, it increases the speed with which you go through this barracks deck. Since you're playing completely cooperatively, you need to have another mechanism to sort of push you through that deck to give you less of a chance to completely optimize your deck. Okay, so that is one of the changes. Another change, anytime that you draw a Master Strike, and let me see if I can find one. Alright, I'm using these, remember, as a Master Strike. Apply the Mastermind's ability, that is a tactic. I gotta find the Mastermind card. Okay, there we go. So I'm playing with Madeline Pryor, the Goblin Queen, and her Master Strike ability is she captures 4 Bystanders. If she already had Bystanders, each player gains a wound. So here's an ability that's going to be giving us wounds throughout the game. Not every Mastermind's going to have those. But in any case, when you draw a Master Strike, resolve the Master Strike ability on any Masterminds in play. Secret Wars adds additional Masterminds that can come into play. Then KO 1 card worth 6 or less, and remember you're going to use the highest cost card in the HQ. And remember, this is happening during the villain phase, so that card is not replaced. Then draw an additional card. So anytime you draw a Master Strike, you're additionally KOing a card from the HQ and drawing another additional card. When you draw a Bystander, you will also then draw an additional card immediately afterward. So basically, every turn, a new villain is going to be entering the city, with the one exception of when you draw a Scheme Twist. And I already mentioned, I'm playing with the legendary difficulty, which is 3 extra Scheme Twists shuffled into this deck. So that means I'm going to get to the really bad last Scheme Twist ability much sooner. Let's see. There's at least one other thing. Hey there, YouTubers. Kitten Hoarder here with just a small addendum. One thing that I forgot to mention that I think is very important to maintaining the difficulty balance, especially if you're adding scheme twists into the game, is to, as you're setting up the game, separate the villain deck. After you've shuffled all of the villains, henchmen, and bystanders together, separate the villain deck into 5 roughly equal piles. You don't have to count them. And separate the Master Strikes so that you'd have 1 in each of the piles. Then distribute the scheme twists as evenly as possible. So, as an example, the game that I just played had 8 scheme twists. I put 2 in the first pile, 1 in the second pile, 2 in the third pile, 1 in the fourth pile, and 2 in the last pile, and that seemed to work out pretty well. If I had upped the difficulty and gone with 11 scheme twists, I would probably have organized it so that maybe all of the piles except for the first one had 2 scheme twists. The first one would only have 1 scheme twist. No, that doesn't work out. I would need 2 in each pile, plus an additional one, which I would probably put near the end, because you want the difficulty to ramp up as you go. And you can actually play with this formula a little bit. If you want fewer scheme twists in the beginning of the game, more scheme twists at the end, you can do it that way. Because as your deck grows, obviously you're going to be able to deal with the problems better. In any case, I just wanted to make that addendum. I also want to add that the legendary difficulty mode with the extra scheme twists is optional to the variant. Obviously, if you're playing with a difficult scheme, as I end up doing in this video, you are perfectly welcome to lower it down to the standard amount, or anywhere in between. I recommend probably starting with 11 and then moving downward if it's just too hard. That way you don't get the sense of an easy win on your first time playing a scheme. Anyway, that's everything, so back to the video. Okay, there's 2 other very small rule changes. One of them is you're going to be playing with the Final Blow rule from the, I believe it was introduced in the Dark City expansion. And the Final Blow rule says that after you've defeated all 4 Mastermind tactics, you then must defeat the Mastermind themselves 1 more time. There's not going to be a tactic attached to this, but you're going to defeat the Mastermind card 5 times rather than 4 times to win the game. The additional rule change is that you are Damn it. Okay, and the final additional rule change is that when you reach the end of the villain deck, everybody loses. So you have to defeat the mastermind 5 times before you run out of cards in the villain deck. And in the standard rules, basically it's a draw in terms of the cooperative objective, and then whoever has the most points wins the game. In this case, you consider that to be a loss. I mean, it's a little better than being defeated by the evil wins, or by having all players killed due to the strikes, but it's still not as good as an actual win. Okay, so those are the rule changes that you're going to need to use to implement any Marvel Legendary expansion using Legendary Encounters as your base set. You're still going to be using mainly the rules from Marvel Legendary, not Legendary Encounters, so you'll need to download the rule book for that and just skim it to see what the changes are. There are actually very few differences. One of them obviously being you're playing cards face up, the villains are going to be escaping, there's some rules involving bystanders that you're going to want to look at, and things like that. But for now, I'm going to assume that you already are sort of familiar with those. I'm not going to go over every single one, and we're just going to get straight to the playthrough. But I'm going to put that in a separate video so that if you want to just look at how this variant works, you can do that. If you want to just go straight to the gameplay, you can do that. So, until then, that's all she wrote.